This is another installment in Parshat Bereishis from Midrash Rabbah, and we are talking about the mysterious episode right after Adam and Chava ate from the Eitz Hadas. You have a very haunting pasuk, which let me read it to you. It says, "Vayishmat kol Hashem Elokim et halech bagan l'ruach hayom," and they heard the voice of God traveling through the garden among the breezes of the day. So, to add to the mystery, the Midrash starts out, instead of explaining it, bringing something even more mysterious. The Midrash seems to be discussing the sound, the speed of sound and the speed of light. So how does that answer anything? So I'm going to theorize that if you look at the definition of the speed of sound, actually what happens is when somebody, like my voice reaching you, is through sound waves being recorded. So sound waves, by their very definition, are leaving the source and they're traveling. So it seems that Adam and Chava were now aware that something theologically had changed. This was like a theological snapshot. This scientific fact was like a theological snapshot. That just like the voice waves travel and separate from the source until they reach your ears, so is it their relationship with God had somewhat diminished. And Mephoshim say that there was a less hashgacha, which means that God's, intimate involvement in their lives had diminished somewhat. And they were trying to make sense of this, and it was very scary to them. In fact, the Midrash says that Vayishmu doesn't mean that they heard, it means it was announced. It was announced that God is approaching. So it's another sign of a separation. They didn't even sense God coming, it had to be announced. And who announced it? One parish says the trees announced it. They said, yeah, they're the thieves who tried to deceive God. God is coming. Or another opinion is the angels announced it. So what's happening now is that God's relationship with man from here on in will sort of be calibrated to the actions of man. And in fact, the Midrash actually spells out that Adam was the first of 7 who actually helped take God's presence further and further away from earth. And let me read you the list. It was Adam, then Cain, then the generation of Enosh, the generation of the flood, the generation of the Tower of Babel, the generation of stone, and finally the generation of the Egyptians. As the wickedness of each generation moved the presence of God a little bit further away. And who brought it back? So the Midrash gives you the list as well. It was Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. They all brought it back. And it continues. Levi, Kahas, Amram, and finally Moshe Rabbeinu. Their righteousness brought the presence of God back down. So it's very interesting. Because some of the commentators want to actually delve into that list. Now you could delve into it thematically and say, well, you could match up Avraham and Adam. In fact, it's said that Avraham was actually a tikkun for Adam. Why? Because essentially, if you look at the story of Avraham, when he was asked to sacrifice his son, so there was a simple request from God, but of course, logic got, screamed at him that this is not something that one does. You don't human sacrifice is against everything he believed at. And you could listen to these other voices and saying, don't listen to that simple voice of God's command, but listen to the voice of reason. But Avraham somehow prevailed, and he followed God's simple command. as opposed to Adam, who was just the opposite. Right? Adam heard straight from God not to eat from the tree, but he was convinced by everything that he was told by his wife Chava. So you could say that Avraham was a tikkun, but it's interesting that there's a commentary called the Imre Yosher, and he actually tries to match it up exactly in order. In other words, if you got up to the last level of the Egyptians being the ones who moved God's presence away, and Avram was the first one to move it back down, so Avram has to be related to the Egyptians. And how is Avram related to the Egyptians? How did Avram able to move God's presence closer? Well, we discussed actually in Midrash Tanchuma that there was a tremendous clash in theology between Avram and the Egyptians. As soon as Avram and Sarah set foot in Egyptian soil, Sarah was taken, because the prevailing attitude was, the prevailing morality in Egypt was that a beautiful woman is not the possession of her husband. Any beautiful woman in the empire is a possession of Paro and his court. And so, of course, as the story unfolds, they were all punished severely, and they found out that there's a higher morality than their perverse morality. And so that's why it was Avram and his chut and his merit that the morality was given, a lesson to the Egyptians. And that's why there is a perfect symmetry between Avram and the generation of the Egyptians. Another example, interesting example, is Yaakov and the generation of Bavel. Yaakov willingly took his family into exile because that's what God, he knew that was God's commandment to Avram, that we were going to go into that's the whole story of Mitzrayim. We were going to go into a land that was not ours, right? So when he moved to Egypt to be reconciled and to see his son Yosef, he knew that they were going into exile, but he did it willingly because that was God's will. And you contrast that with Bavel. They're the ones that built the Tower of Bavel because they were rebelling against the idea that anyone could break up their unity, right? They said, Pen Nefotz, we don't want to be scattered. Let's build this tower and stay together. But of course, they were punished and they were scattered. So listening to God and even going into exile voluntarily was the way to remedy the sin of the Tower of Babel. The last example I want to give you is interesting. It's Amram and Cain, right? Cain killed his brother Hevel, and that pushed God's presence away. We say that Amram, who was the father of Moshe and Aaron and Miriam, the famous story that he separated from his wife until Miriam pointed out that you're worse than the Paro. Paro only wants to kill the male children, and you're trying to kill everybody by not procreating with your wife. So he took his wife back, and he did it selflessly. He and his wife selflessly decided to bring children into the world, even though the despair of Egypt. That was a remedy for what Cain did. After all, Cain selfishly murdered his brother for the greed. He wanted to own the whole world. Half the world wasn't enough for him. And of course, by murdering his brother, he in effect murdered billions of people who would have emerged from his brother. So you see that the selfless act of bringing children into the world remedied the selfish act of potentially murdering billions of people. So bottom line is that we see that the moral of this story is that although there are wicked people, it could be very few that could actually move God's presence away from the world. It takes only one person, one great person, to bring it back. And that is a great source of hope for us. Have a great Shabbos.